Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the School Rules Podcast. My name is Dr. Jerry Burkett, and thank you again for joining me on the show. I think we've got a great week. We've been on a bit of a hiatus, but we're back. I've got a couple of great guests this week for us. First is Dr. Maggie Marcus, and she is a fellow at the Century Foundation, and she's also the executive director of the Sullivan Family Charitable Foundation. We're going to have a great conversation on bilingual education and what leadership should look like for a bilingual classroom. I also have another special guest on, and he has his book, Chris Joffe, right here, the author of All Clear. And Chris Joffe we had a great conversation about managing during crisis and what that should look like for school leaders. I also want to talk about school culture. We have a great episode this week, so let's get into it. Well, it finally happened. Texas Rangers lost their manager, Bruce Bochy. Their not long time, 3 seasons, but long time enough to win a World Series. And I got one of my bobbleheads, my Adolis Garcia bobblehead, and I got a few more behind me. You can see some of those. But huge Rangers fan. I've been living in Texas all of my life, and the Rangers, for a big part of my adult life, have been an important part of that. I have season tickets. I follow the Rangers religiously. I get upset when they lose. It's just part of me and my family and so forth. And I mentioned Bruce Bochy for a reason, because this particular season, and for those of you who listen to the podcast and those of you who know me, we're a big baseball family, and we have been for a long time. And so the Rangers are just one tiny segment of part of our culture, which is kind of the theme for this week. I bring up Bruce Bochy to start the show because what's been interesting about this particular baseball season, and I'm sorry if you don't follow baseball, but I'm going somewhere with this, so stay with me. Rangers finished this season 81-81. Which was kind of indicative of a team that had outstanding pitching, probably the best pitching in baseball, probably, at least statistically, but horrible hitting. The hitting just wasn't there. And so it just seemed to be a perfect balance of two very important aspects of baseball that just didn't work out in the Rangers' favor. And so along with that, there had been some grumblings, how things work in the media, where players say things or things get kind of leaked out of locker rooms and clubhouses and so forth. And there was this one former player who played for the Rangers in the early part of the season, around April, May. His name is Kevin Pillar. And this is documented, so I'm not making this up, and I can link it if you want to go see it. But he was on some podcast, post Rangers career. Things didn't work out. He left the team, and he was an older player anyway, so he's retired and he's doing things, whatever. And he's on podcasts, and he said something that I thought was interesting. It sort of struck me, not only as a fan, but as a educational leadership professor. And it struck me when he talked about culture in the clubhouse and how it was a little bit different than other teams he had played on. And he was surprised by it because the Rangers had just come off of winning just 2 seasons ago, 2023, winning a world championship, winning the World Series. And he was a little taken aback by, some of the clubhouse culture and some of the guys just kind of doing their own thing. And maybe there wasn't this connectivity in the clubhouse that in his experience was a little different than another championship team he had played for, where there seemed to be a little more cohesiveness and a little bit more connectivity amongst the guys and so on and so forth. So I got to thinking about this culture question. What does culture look like? And we talk about it in ed leadership, in principal development and training school leaders. Culture is paramount. It's one of the first things we talk about. It's a foundational discussion. So I want to talk a little bit about what culture looks like today, not only for a school, but in an organization even as large as the Texas Rangers. And culture has to start from the top. It has to start from leadership. So let's break down what culture looks like. And we will talk about it in a baseball context, but also in a school context. What should culture look like for your organization, for your school? Let's take a look. All right, so let's start with the definition. And very simply put, culture is our collective beliefs, it's our behaviors, and it's the systems that are in place that sort of define our experience whether it's in our school or our baseball team, our organization, and so forth. And what's great about culture is that it is uniquely defined by the people who are in that group, okay? When I teach culture in my classes, I like to talk about it in the context of Christmas, okay? And for those who celebrate Christmas or any other of the holidays that come around that time of year, but particularly Christmas, what I like to ask my students is, do you put up a Christmas tree? Do you have a meal? Do you open presents? Do you go to church? I kind of ask those questions because I'm trying to establish a context around the culture of Christmas to point out that the way you do Christmas versus the way I might do Christmas, your family, my family, we are all doing Christmas, this collective doing of Christmas, but we're all doing it differently because our family's cultures, our beliefs, our behaviors are unique to us and they're acceptable to us. And so how we put up our tree, when we put up our tree, what we put on our tree, it's all going to be different because we all choose to celebrate Christmas in different ways. Some of us go to church, some of us don't. Some of us have a meal, some of us don't. Some of us have different meals. Like I remember students saying, well, we have turkey, we have ham, we have tamales. So even the meals are different. And when people choose to celebrate Christmas, sometimes the presents are opened on Christmas Eve. Sometimes the adults do the presents on Christmas Eve. Sometimes the kids open on Christmas Day. It's different for everyone. And the thing is, it's not wrong. It's what you choose, your collective beliefs, your behaviors, the systems that you've put in place to create that human experience. Now, what do you do when new people come into your culture? When you've got new players, new family members, people that have married into your family and they're brand new, they have to be introduced to that culture because it's not theirs. And so you as a leader, whoever that leader is, you have to make a choice and have to teach them about your culture and the way we do things. And those are very simple questions that we have to ask. And so I'm just going to posing questions to help you build culture because culture it's designed, it's not default. Cultures can be changed. Cultures can grow stale and stagnant. Cultures can become hostile. And unfortunately, culture can become compliant, stale, stagnant, and it can sort of fall apart on you if it's not cultivated and it's not treated with respect. So let's break down a little bit about whether it's your baseball team or your school, what can we do about culture to make it feel welcoming, supportive, and that everybody is a part of this contribution? Now, culture can be treated like a filter. It determines how we respond to challenges, how we celebrate our successes, how we hold each other accountable. And when you're a leader, we're kind of architects of that culture. So whether you realize it or not, the way you walk, the way you talk, the things that you say, the things that you choose to do and not do, because that's important too, can dictate the culture. Because, for example, if people are acting a certain way that is inappropriate and you ignore those behaviors, by default, you're endorsing those behaviors. You're accepting those behaviors. So it's important to know and understand when to intervene and when to not intervene. And I think it just begins with some very, very basic questions. So number one, what do we want our school to feel like? What do we want our baseball team to feel like? And I know it sounds silly, but what kind of school do you want to walk into? How often have you walked into a school and it just feels like people don't want to be here? It's not a happy place. You also want to think about what values drive your school system, drive your organization, drive your baseball team. What is it that you value? And honestly, for a lot of my students, we even stop there. And I walk my students to an understanding of what is it that you value. If you're going to be in education, if you're going to be a school leader, you've got to have a set of values that are going to drive your decision-making as a school leader. There are things that you have to believe about students, about teachers, about parents, about everyone that's involved in your system. You have to have some beliefs and values that are going to drive your system. Otherwise, you're not going to have a very good culture. And then how do we make those values visible to everyone? Now, it's in our discipline meetings, in our celebrations, in our faculty meetings. How do we make our culture a part of the things that we do each and every day? Your culture can be embedded in your instruction. It can be embedded in your parent meetings and how you manage a special ed department. There's culture everywhere, and it can be driven by what you choose to do. Now, there are some tools out there to help you build culture. And I'm not saying that this is an easy thing to do. I can say that it's like a dying plant. You've got to give it water and food and nutrients, and if not, the culture is going to change on you whether you like it or not. Or someone else is going to pick up the slack, and you might be finding yourself out of a job because you have forced yourself into a bad culture that has changed on you and you ignored it completely, which is what I think happened to the manager of the Texas Rangers. But that is an aside. Here's some tools to help you build a culture, and one of it starts with rituals and routines. Your morning meetings, your shout-outs, the shared language of your building, that develops your identity. Let me give you an example of what I did for one of my schools. One of my first principal jobs was at Lyndon Baines Johnson Elementary, LBJ Elementary School. And one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to establish sort of this ritual for celebrating success. And the way I did that was had teachers nominate other teachers, staff members in the building who were just going that extra mile, somebody that was just doing it differently than everyone else, that just stood out. And we called it the Can Do Award right there, Can Do. And this was a little piece of marble that says Can Do on it that was on LBJ's desk when he was president. And it was his reminder that I can do anything to change the world, to make things powerful. And actually, it's written in Chinese on the back, so I'm not sure the origin of that, but you could buy these at the time. I don't know if you can buy them now, but we could buy these at the LBJ Library store online, which is located down in Austin. So I bought a bunch of these, and I kept one for myself too, and gave these out as awards for teachers and staff members and later on students. And I don't know if this is continued on because sometimes when the school leader leaves, so does the culture. But this is just an example of rituals and routines, shout-outs that sort of build an identity. Like, this is who we are. We're a can-do spirit, and this was just sort of the ritual and routine language for LBJ. Another way to build your culture is to not do it by yourself. It's not your culture, it's your school's culture, it's your organization's culture. So you've got to bring other voices together to determine what do you value, what do you believe, how do you want to celebrate and enjoy success. And you can't do this alone. You have to do this through conversation, bringing those voices together, helping to solve problems, because no leader can work on this in isolation. Now, you lead those discussions and you start with those conversations, but you have to bring in other voices in order to dictate what this culture is going to look like, because we're all going to live in it. We're all going to work in it, and we have to do it together. Another great culture building tool is take some time with you, your leadership team, the important players on your campus to come together and really analyze what the systems look like in your organization. All those major systems that come together, because in systems thinking and system organization, if you don't have great systems in place, remember, they all work together. And if one system is disruptive or out of place, then it can disrupt the entire organization, the entire system. So maybe in a baseball context, we pitching and hitting, some of those systems weren't working in sync. The top level organization, how we do practice, how we organize for games, all of those are systems that have to work together in sync in order to achieve the goals that you're looking for. So be a systems thinker. Organize your systems, bring those major people together, and really begin to study, are things working the way they're supposed to be working? Because that could be a major culture disruptor too. And the last thing that you could possibly do, to at least to start building some quality culture at your school, and I'm not sure what this would look like in a baseball context, but for a school, it's instructional coaching and having common instructional language. And I could probably do a whole other podcast segment on this alone, but when you have a common instructional language that everyone is speaking, everyone is doing, and it comes up all the time in your meetings, in your data discussions, in your PLCs, in your department meetings, and wherever, that common instructional language, how you choose to do things, is very, very valuable. And if you have people speaking different instructional terms, different instructional philosophies, that right there can be enough of a disruption for your campus to really make things struggle. Not sure what that looks like in a baseball context, since we're trying to connect the two here, but at least for a school context, in this instance, is a school leadership podcast, instructional coaching language is very important. In fact, I'll probably end up doing a whole segment on it here in the future. Now, culture, it's not just one singular leadership task. It's a community commitment. It's bringing together your teachers, your students, your families, and everyone needs to feel it. So just think about it. Ask yourself, what stories are being told about your school? What behaviors are being rewarded? What are the things that we celebrate? What kind of systems are we reinforcing or undermining? Where are our values? If you want to change the culture, if you want to move things forward in a direction that just means success for everyone, you start by changing the culture. And you start by asking those very simple questions. What are we doing? What are the stories? What are the rituals, the routines? What do we celebrate? What do we value? And most importantly, what do we believe? So think about that this week. And as you're thinking about it, it doesn't have to be done all in one day. It takes time to build culture. It takes time to build strong culture that's long-lasting. So start small. Start with your department. Start with your admin team. Start with just a small group of people, or just something that's in your locus of control. Whatever that is, you can begin by starting very, very small to build a strong culture that people want to be a part of, that people are proud of. And if you think about it in a broader context, is what makes you who you are outside of school is also culture. So bring that into the school context. What kind of school do you want to be? What kind of department do you want to be? What kind of classroom do you want to have? Whatever it is, start small with culture and you will begin to see some change that ultimately it's just going to be amazing, and you will feel a real difference at your school. Welcome back to the School Rules Podcast. I am here and I'm very excited to talk with Dr. Maggie Marcus. She is a fellow with the Century Foundation, working on improving prospects for English learners. She is also the executive director of the Sullivan Family Charitable Foundation, which is a private family foundation dedicated to improving educational outcomes for English learners. They are also a responsive grant-making body for both domestic and abroad organizations. She's also an adjunct at the University of Maryland. Welcome, Dr. Marcus. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Should I call you Jerry or Dr.?
You can call me Jerry. Yeah, we
Okay,
don't
you
stand
can
no
call me
formality
Maggie.
here.
Well,
So thank you,
okay.
Maggie, for being here.
My pleasure.
So just as we start, tell us a little bit about you and what you do and where you're from and how we got to this point.
Okay. So I'm Maggie Marcus. I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, right outside of DC. I've been here about 17 years, which is kind of crazy to me. I'm from Massachusetts originally. I spent my early years post-college in Puerto Rico as a public school teacher, and that was what got me onto an education trajectory. I'm an alternatively certified teacher, or I probably not anymore, but I was. But I was. I earned a teaching certification in Puerto Rico. I spent a little bit of time in Sacramento in California in medical sales, and then moved back to Massachusetts for my master's at Tufts, which led me to DC because I came to work for the Central Intelligence Agency, which is was a great experience. But that's what landed me in DC before I then went from the CIA back to the classroom as a second grade bilingual or dual language teacher. And from there, I was an instructional coach and got my doctorate at University of Maryland in College Park, and I'm still there. I teach just as an adjunct professor now. As you mentioned, I run the Sullivan Family Charitable Foundation, which is our my family's foundation, founded by my parents. Um, and do some writing with the Century Foundation. I have three daughters who I'm raising bilingually with Spanish and English. I have a husband who works on Capitol Hill and a whole bunch of pets. Um, and I'm drinking my afternoon coffee because I really, as a former Starbucks employee, I really love coffee. And yeah, so here we are.
Here we are. Well, let's start with the foundation. Talk to me a little bit about that. You're founded by your parents, and talk to me about the foundation, what it does, and what your focus is.
Yes, so our foundation started in 2007 by my parents when my dad sold when his they sold his company and they had a some funding to put in a charitable foundation, and for almost a decade or more it was really a sort of checkbook philanthropy model where there was a little bit of giving that my siblings and I got to do once a year type of thing. But not until the second kind of wealth event of when my dad retired and they put more funds into the foundation did they decide to bring me on as the executive director. So I've been in the role for about 4 years. I'm really having been a practitioner in dual language education. It feels pretty natural for me to do a lot of my foundation work around dual language education and specifically in the DC area. And then I also manage some of the interests of my family. So we have a few grants that we do with veteran organizations, arts and culture, and one thing we call like community vibrancy. In underserved and marginalized communities. So yeah, it's really fun. I think it is a me kind of figuring out my own way. Um, but I really enjoy the work.
When I was a school principal in bilingual education, one of the things that always frustrated me was bilingual to a lot of people means Spanish.
Right.
And living in Texas, where I am, that of course is the other language other than English that is primary, and that's obvious. But bilingualism doesn't mean Spanish. Biliteracy doesn't mean just Spanish. So talk to people who are listening to hear what does bilingualism mean to you?
It's a great question. So I think probably the reason that people equate in a lot of cases bilingualism or biliteracy with Spanish is because it's the second most spoken language in the US. And I think the last number I saw was about 80% of English learners are Spanish speakers. So it is a huge majority. But um, bilingualism and multilingualism really means any sort of combination of languages. In many cases, as you know, in the States, it's English and another language. But certainly in the Washington, D.C. area, we see a lot of representation of other languages, not just Spanish, like Farsi, Amharic, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, French. So it definitely can mean many different things. And I think often of the school where my daughters go is an international school, and there's kids who speak three or four languages. And it's a part, they have parents who are from two different linguistic backgrounds. They're learning a third language in school, and of course, English is the playground language, if you will. So, but it can be a whole range of different types of linguistic profiles.
It reminded when you said Farsi, it reminded me a couple of years ago, the town of Amarillo, Texas, far west, Panhandle, Texas, farming and ranching communities abroad suddenly had a large influx of Farsi into the
Mm.
school system. So, since this is largely a school leadership podcast, how should a school leader who
Mm.
was not even familiar with that language at all because it was an influx of workers that were coming into their farming, ranching, oil industry. Suddenly deal with a language that that's not English, it's not Spanish, it's now something else I've probably never heard of. How should school leaders respond to that?
I think we're fortunate in many ways. I can't give you an AI tool that would be like a perfect fit, but I do think we're fortunate in many ways to have some technology at our fingertips for being able to communicate with people from other language backgrounds that we may not be familiar with. I also think, and I like to think getting the community involved. So whether it's parents who are bilingual Farsi English speakers or um, a local community, if it's a religious organization or some other sort of group that has someone, at least one person who's bilingual and can come and be at least the translator and also be sort of the cultural representative. But I think I also, would really think about that community and parents and trying to learn. I mean, learning about their culture and their language and from a place of curiosity. And so then incorporating them into the school community so that they feel included and also that you can learn more about their background, culture wise and language wise.
So, what are the best models to do that instructionally that you have found that school districts should be looking at or adopting from a curricular standpoint to help support bilingual learners and ESL because that's a whole other issue in the classroom. What have you found is the best way to do that?
Well, I think it tends to be more straightforward when it's Spanish, which is also probably why Spanish is such a popular example. In DC, for example, DC public schools, all of the bilingual schools are Spanish English. There are some charters that offer different languages, but the research shows definitely that kids who have access to content, language, and content in their own language background or their native language are more successful at learning English, acquiring English, and then their own language. So ideally, if you could have a model where there was some Farsi instruction in your example, to help those students not only maintain and grow their biliteracy and bilingualism in Farsi, but also acquire English. And it usually takes, I mean, anywhere from 6 to 8 years for students to become bilingual, what we would say bilingual or on level, if not past their monolingual English speaking peers. But really having that content, access to content in their native language is a really important piece of their progression and English acquisition.
What can they do better from your perspective? What can they do better to support bilingual students? You mentioned that relationship connection, building, connecting with families, that's paramount in school leadership anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, but for someone like me, who my first principal job, I didn't know anything about bilingual education, and I had to kind of learn on the job. What could I have done better as a school leader approaching that situation for the first time, working with bilingual students, and that being completely foreign to me?
Well, I think one thing I really love about principals and principalship is that you are essentially the creator of a school culture, right? Of course, you have district and mandates and all sorts of things that live outside. I'm sure you could tell me a lot about that. Um, but you really are who teachers look up to, who parents, students all look up to and look to for what sort of place is this learning community. And so I think one way to me, and I've never been a principal, for full disclosure, but one thing that I think about a lot is just establishing and creating a space where all languages are welcome and where everyone feels a sense of belonging and they feel like their culture and language background is represented and seen. But I think just valuing language and acknowledging that bilingualism is an asset and not a deficit really can go a long way for creating a warm learning community.
So That being said, what are some promising models that are happening in recent research for bilingual education? What's the trend? Where are we going? What do we need to do next for bilingual education from your point of view?
I think a few things come to mind. One is that is established, and I speak from the District, Maryland, Virginia area, where I think this is a better practice in Texas and certainly in California. But is some sort of pathway to bilingual teacher education, whether certification, whether or not that's we could probably talk all day about alt cert and traditional, pathways. But I think one thing we're seeing nationwide is a shortage in bilingual teachers. And I think we need to be better about establishing different ways to get people who are bilingual or multilingual into the teaching profession, and to give them the professional development or the training that they need to be successful. In that, I think we put, and I think the same as with principals, we put a lot on teachers and school leaders. And I think sometimes that one, creating that sense of warmth, and belonging in a school can also be very beneficial for teachers, so that they want to stay, right? I think we have also we see retention difficulties with teachers, and I think specifically around specialized teachers like ESL teachers or special education teachers. And so I think really working with them, developing, giving them the skill set they need to be successful is a really big one. I think also there's a second idea or something I'm seeing is less of this division of language in bilingual classrooms. So more acceptance of using the native language for acquiring, let's say, English. And I don't mean that the teacher is translating and saying things in Spanish and then in English, or in English and then in Spanish, but really it's really for the students, not so much for the teacher. Just the students to be able to, if they're thinking and they're practicing their, let's say, their English, and they're like, oh, but ¿cómo se dice? Say puente, and the teacher's like, oh, puente, you mean bridge? Okay, and they can kind of build that in.
Mhm.
I think that's also a good practice because I don't know about you, but I've definitely been in language learning classrooms where it's like you don't want to speak if you can't say the right word, or that there's going to be this consequence of saying it in English instead of Spanish. And so I think just giving students the space to learn the language without the sort of really rigid structure of like you can only do this and only that. Like just giving some flexibility there.
What are some common misconceptions that people tend to have about bilingual education? Maybe even teachers and principals, but just generally, what would you want to say to correct some of those common misconceptions about bilingual biliteracy education?
One thing I see is that kids should learn one language before they master another language. I hear that sometimes. Or if they have access to their native language, they're not going to acquire English. Their brains are very flexible, and they have the ability to really absorb different linguistic repertoires, if you will, or different linguistic systems at the same time. And so I think sometimes I see this from parents and teachers alike, but there's this fear of, oh, well, if they get to have access to learning in Spanish, like maybe they're not going to learn English, or if they don't know English, how are they going to learn French, or whatever the system is. And so I think that's one area that's just, we know that kids can learn more than one language at the same time. And so I think really trusting in their little brains to be able to process, and do that successfully. I still see policy, and this is maybe of a policy level, but there's still like it takes a long time to learn an additional language. And
Mhm.
so I think we have this general idea that we want like 1 year and students should be on grade level and they should be, fluent in English. And we have these sort of misconceived notions of like how fast, not how fast, but yeah, how fast language takes to
Mhm.
learn, to really learn and so I think that's one thing too that we don't always do a good job because we have standardized tests or we have other indicators that we need to be able to show data to the state agency or whatever it is. And so I think sometimes we really need to acknowledge that it's going to take a little bit longer. And you, of course, want to be sure that students are on the right track and progressing, but that the real sweet spot won't be seen for
Mhm.
5-ish years until students have been in a successful, let's say, dual language education model.
It is an investment and it takes time.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
And that's a common tale in education. And we're not always as patient as
Right.
we need to be because obviously everyone learns at a different pace. But when there's an investment coming down and then there are requirements in place that sometimes we want to speed that along. So we want to see progress much faster than it takes to get that progress. So I have to ask because I'm going to show you my Duolingo as I learned
Oh,
I'm learning German.
oh,
So,
cool.
but this is like 670 days. Yeah, 670 days to me be a level 26 on whatever that means to be German. But
Uh-huh.
I'm bringing this up because I read it well.
Uh-huh.
But if you were to plot me down in Germany right now, I'm going to struggle. I just know I am. It's going to take me a while to, number one, have the confidence to spout out German words and actually figure out what I'm trying to do to navigate that. So, talk to me
Mm-hmm.
about gamification of learning language because there's a bunch of apps out there,
Mm-hmm.
and I probably could get through Germany fine.
Mm-hmm.
But if I was to have a conversation with a person in German, I'm going to struggle because that recall, it's not going to be there immediately. So, talk to me about your perspective on the gamification of language learning.
That's interesting. I think my middle child has been learning Italian on Duolingo, and she was on like a 180-day streak or something, and we were in Venice this summer, and I was like you lead it, and she was like
Yeah.
and she kind of froze. I think the way that I learned Spanish, and I took Spanish because I didn't like the French teacher. That was really like the the decision, and going into eighth grade. Um, and it was a very traditional model, right? And not, I've never done Duolingo, but not dissimilar from Duolingo, where you're okay, conjugate verbs and learn these words and memorize this. And I think that method doesn't really work. I think it's a for some reason we in the United States, I think generally kind of get stuck on this model, but really people need a chance to speak and to practice. And so I think the best way is to, if you can, yeah, be in Germany or in Austria or even, if you could find a German speaking friend to have coffee with and practice German. I think those authentic interactions are what really help with language learning. I do think games can make it more engaging, certainly than sitting in a classroom and having to memorize, subjunctive forms or whatever. Um, but I think really we really need that interpersonal those interactions to be able to really process and to keep learning a different language.
Maggie, this has been an awesome conversation. I would
Yeah.
love to have you on as a guest again. So, as we wrap
Thank
up,
you.
how can we reach out to you, your foundation, if we want to get in touch? So tell us more about what we can do to support the work you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you. I am on LinkedIn. That's really the only social media that I am on these days. And then we do, yes, like you said, we have a website, Sullivan Family Charitable Foundation.org. I kind of question myself, but I'm sure we can put the link in the in the show
Yes,
notes. And yeah, those are great ways to get in touch with me.
great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This is awesome.
Thank
I
you,
hope to have
Jerry.
you again
Thank
someday. I
you.
appreciate your
Yeah,
insight.
sounds good. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you. All right, so welcome back to the School Rules Podcast. I'm excited today. My guest today is Chris Joffe. He is the leader of one of the nation's best and leading safety organizations for schools and events. They actively support more than 2,000 clients nationwide. He is very passionate about health and safety, and these are central to building strong communities also, but strong schools. So, Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. School safety is one of those things that honestly, if we could go right into school safety, I don't want to say it gets glossed over, but it's one of those things that when I first started off being a principal, you're just kind of handed a manual and it's tabbed with like, oh, in case of gas leak, do this, right? And then you're told to have, sort of an emergency response team on campus, which might be another administrator and maybe a counselor and some teacher that you probably trust, and oh yeah, maybe the nurse. So talk to me about when you have these conversations with schools, what does that look like in order for them to get to truly understand emergency preparedness? And before you answer, I always tell my students, it's not just school shootings. Okay, there's more than that, because that obviously dominates the conversation. So lead us into what your concept of emergency preparedness and school preparation looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say first, I think you and others like you who receive a manual should feel grateful because in so many cases, so many principals don't even get the manual. And I think you're exactly right. I think when we talk about our work, when we talk about school safety, people go straight to the school shooting. Or I'm based in Los Angeles. At the beginning of this year, people would go straight to the wildfire. We go straight to whatever the most recent event was that made us feel uneasy. And the problem with that is that because we go straight to that event, we forget the 150 other things that could go wrong. Please don't stop listening because I said 150 things could go wrong. What we're going to talk about today is the ways to make them go right too. But because we find ourselves kind of attached to that last thing, we can really make a few mistakes. And so my core belief in emergency preparedness in schools is that everything comes down to leadership and communication. As principals, we have one job. As leaders, we have one job, and that is to establish a mechanism for leadership during the emergency. And importantly, if you're a principal that hates emergencies, you get nervous, you don't like the sight of blood, you get scared when things go wrong, that's okay. I didn't say you have to be the leader. I said you have to establish a mechanism for leadership during the emergency. And then second, you've got to be able to communicate. And I talk about communication as the concentric circles of communication. So I want to start with the people that are on campus that are closest to the emergency that's happening. And then I want to expand to the rest of campus, the rest of the community. Then I want to expand from there to local police, local fire, local authorities as they respond, and eventually then get to families, to the board, to the district, to that other set of groups that are folks that are not on campus. But I think, and we can break this down a little bit more, at the end of the day, this is all about leadership and communication. And the good news is, as school leaders, you're already pretty good at both of those things.
So what have you seen that principals kind of bring to the table when it comes to school leadership? How does those two things tie together?
Yeah, so I would start with, and we use a fancy term for it, it's incident commander. But I would start with making sure that you have an incident commander. Basically, that's somebody who's in charge. And the really important rule of thumb here is you want at least 3 people to be capable of stepping into that incident command role, being capable of being in charge during an emergency. And I strive for 5 to 7. And I realize that in some schools, your leadership team isn't that big. You're looking at the coach by the time you get to that place. That's okay. It may not always be that it's the person that's in charge at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It may be the person who's in charge at 2 o'clock in the morning. Okay. When the pipe burst happens and they have to make a decision about open versus closed, if you're not accessible, it may be the overwinter break while you're on vacation somewhere with your family, you're out of touch, out of reach, and somebody else needs to step in. So get to that place where you have at least 3 people who are capable of leading your school through an emergency. Again, ideally 5 to 7. And then, really importantly, make sure that they all know that they're on that list. Every so often, I find that school leaders have this great list of people. I present it, and people go, wait a second, me? No. And so be honest with yourselves, with the people that are on that list, that they are there. And then also, and importantly, just as I'm kind of giving you the opt-out permission, give others the opt-out permission. I would much rather somebody say, hey, I don't feel comfortable leading during an emergency. This is scary. This isn't my forte, whatever the case may be. Or, and we're seeing more and more of this, is the world has changed around us, I've had past trauma that's directly related to school safety. And so I question my judgment, I question my comfort, I question my traumatic response and some of my stress response that may emerge during an incident. And so I'm not sure I am the best person to lead our school. So be maybe human about it and allow others to do the same. And honestly, that's the first and most important piece.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that as far as being on the list and possibly even opting out on the list. It reminded me of very early in my administrative career. A gentleman walked onto our campus, and as he was there signing in the office, he had a heart attack. And so having to leap into action and all of a sudden, I did take CPR and now I actually have to use it. So talk about that list. Who should be on it? And someone who's skilled in CPR or former military, like who should I be thinking about as I'm building my dream team to help me with emergencies on campus?
Yeah, so if we start to break apart the team a little bit, the first group of people that you're going to think about, that first list, is your incident commanders, people who can be in charge. And that's probably principal, assistant principal, maybe your ops leader if you have an ops leader. It's people who know and understand the way the community works, people who can make decisions, and people who can communicate with the leadership team and with the community from a place of credibility. But then you're also going to need some other folks. And if you go to our website, there's some free resources around this. If you go to FEMA, there are some free resources around this. But basically what you're going to want to do is build out a set of teams, and we'll call them strike teams. Again, sometimes when I use that language, it sounds a little bit like it's really formal or sort of government related. And I guess that, FEMA is who originated this stuff. But the idea is you want some teams who you can activate to do specific functions. The most important teams, and by the way, most people will have a search and rescue team, a first aid team. Almost every single school will have an attendance team who actually takes attendance of kids. By the way, pro tip, make sure you also take attendance for adults. And speaking of visitors, take attendance for your visitors too. As a regular visitor to your schools, please make sure that you account for me during the emergency. This is selfish, but just do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you'll also probably have some other teams. You may have crisis counseling. You may have like a facilities or a logistics team who does things like shutting off the power and the gas and those sorts of things. You may have a security team dedicated. You also really should have a reunification team. And you asked the question about like, is it former military? Are these people CPR trained? Each of those teams has a different zeitgeist, a different set of kind of protocols that they're going to follow, a different set of expectations in terms of what they're going to go and do for you. And so you'll purpose build your team based on the people you've got. Often science teachers are great search and rescue team members, and they're often very good first aid team members. They're pretty comfortable with blood. They're smart. They're like kind of logistics and process thinkers. They're used to the scientific method, right? They can kind of follow a process. Our music teachers and art teachers and other specialists tend to be the best folks to put on the reunification team. They know everybody. They know lots of families, right? They know lots and lots of kids. And so they often have, family connections, and they can make really good decisions about who kids can be released to. So you'll kind of purpose build based on the different teams and then who's within your leadership team and maybe more broadly, your teaching team.
Okay, so that gives a lot for a principal to think about outside of that manual or that binder that I mentioned. Let me just ask you, emergency, to me, the term emergency feels like a very broad term. So do you break down what constitutes an emergency, or is just everything an emergency and then we plan based upon the level of activity that's occurring? Talk to me through that.
Yeah, I define emergencies as defined by the principal. And as a result, there's a lot of context with that. A more experienced principal is going to call less things an emergency. But a new principal, and new principals, if you're listening right now, like I see you, I hear you, I am with you. If your lunch is delivered late, that's an emergency for you, right? If you have 500 kids waiting for lunch and you don't have a solution for them, that could be a crisis. Mm-hmm. And so, as a brand new principal, you're going to activate some of these teams. You're going to call the district. You're going to double call, right? We always say, call twice if it's an emergency. Mm-hmm. You're going to do some of those things for that scenario. Whereas if you've been in your leadership role for 15 years, you're going to go, hey, Domino's, I got a problem. And they're going to come and deliver, right? And so because of that, right, your experience, your context, your own, again, just like your own humanity is going to come into what makes an emergency. In general, I think of emergencies as things that interrupt the school day for more than a couple of minutes. Well, an earthquake comes through, shakes a little bit, and sometimes, especially if you're in North Texas, people think, well, did a really big truck just drive by, right? Like, what was that? You're not quite sure because it's so foreign, it's so unexpected. And so that may not be an emergency for one school, and it may be an emergency for the other, just based on context. The ones who felt it a little bit more, who activated their drop, cover, and hold procedure, who evacuated, well, now their day has been interrupted, so they're going to continue through the emergency process. Other things we think about, though, of course, active shooters, we talk a lot about kind of prevention and strategies around that. We talk about natural disasters, and then we talk about other human-based emergencies, things like swatting and bomb threats and these other incidents that we've seen a lot of this start of this school year that are frankly not even a real emergency, right? They themselves are false, and yet they cause a major emergency for many of our schools as well.
Right. Or the emergencies that cause other emergencies, like the earthquake that caused the gas leak and so on and so on. And then again, I'm glad we're having this conversation because I want my students and then anyone else who's listening, a lot of educators listen, to change that mindset on what constitutes an emergency. For example, when I was a principal, it was during a period of a lot of rain that we had had during that week, and a snake had gotten into my school building. So I have got this slithering snake going down the hallway, dodging students and teachers, and that is an emergency. That was where we have to have a full disruption of the learning day and to try to figure out how do we wrangle a snake out of the building because everyone was freaking out. So that's where I kind of wanted to lead that conversation. Let everybody know, hey, anything can be an emergency. It's in the eye of the beholder.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will tell you, one of the most common reasons that we activate, we call lockdowns and holds and secure campuses, we bucket all of that stuff into a movement restriction. And one of the most common reasons that we activate a movement restriction is an animal on campus. I always use the story swarm of bees when I do trainings for faculty because I can watch people's shoulders rise, their anxiety go up if I start to use words like active shooter or bad guy.
Right.
And so to kind of help everybody bypass denial, help everybody kind of think about a scenario that feels a little bit more, well, I'm just more willing to think about it. Heck, right? A swarm of bees is scary, but it's something I can comprehend. I can kind of think through. I can imagine on our own campus, and I don't have to feel as afraid. And so I always use that example, and often I will have folks raise their hands somewhere mid-presentation, and they'll say, we actually had a swarm of bees, we had a coyote, we had a cougar, we had a whatever the case may be on our campus, and we had to activate one of those movement restrictions in order to keep ourselves safe from it.
You mentioned the wildfires, and then so I'm just prompted to ask, what did you see from school leaders in their response during that horrible, torrid time? What was the reaction? Because again, it's one of those situations where it's not like a school shooting where that just sort of happens and you have to react.
Yeah.
Wildfires were around you for several days into weeks. So what does that look like from that perspective where you're surrounded by that and smoke and fire, et cetera?
There were two really concrete experiences that our schools had. Maybe a third. The third would be schools that were like outside of the immediate LA area who were in need of support because their families maybe were affected or because the traffic patterns were affected, but for all intents and purposes they were kind of okay outside of the danger zone. Then there were schools that were proximate to the danger zone but not in it. And for those schools, the tough decisions, and we just saw this in Texas actually with flooding this summer, but the challenge then becomes, how do I navigate, well, one, do I open or close in response to this major emergency that's happening? Maybe it doesn't directly affect me. Maybe I'm not immediately in the danger zone, but I have students who are. I may have students who have been impacted, lives that have been changed, in some cases even lost as a result of an event like this. And so how do I open, how do I navigate, how do I manage the community through that? So I would say that's kind of bucket number two, and the most unique bucket, perhaps, because it's really broad. It depends on where you are, how your community is composed. And then bucket number one, the schools that I think you're asking about, I know most people think about, are the schools who were directly in areas where they were either on fire themselves or proximate to fire themselves. One school in particular, we had 23 schools in total. that suffered damage such that they couldn't return immediately following the fires being put out. That number surprises people a lot because it's huge. We've never seen an event like that. Our own crisis management infrastructure was not designed for 23 schools. We were designed for 3 to 7. That was kind of our range. But we went, holy cow, how do we support all of the schools who need it? But one school in particular evacuated that morning, saw the fires break out on the hillside, evacuated that morning. And I mentioned the reunification process earlier. It is so critical. If there's one thing you take from this call, this session, this conversation, practice a reunification drill. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I'll share with you, if we can put it in the notes, a kind of Gantt chart to get to practice. I have about a 3-year outline that works for a school who's never done anything about it. Who, you just got the binder, it's got the tabs, but you've never even opened it, and you can get there. And you don't need to pay money. You don't need like lots of resources. You don't need tons of time. You can get there over the course of 3 years. But this school practiced their reunification exercise actually for the first time in response to having to evacuate during the fire. And the most unique circumstances present. For example, folks were driving on the wrong side of the road to get out of this particular area, like you see in Florida, sometimes in Houston, southern Texas, right, where you start to see people going up both sides of the highway.
Contraflow, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in this case, there was so much traffic even still that people actually got out of their vehicles and walked.
Wow.
Well, now the fire department can't get in. Yeah. And so now the fire is getting worse. They're bringing bulldozers in to clear a path for these vehicles, or clear a path from these vehicles, so that they can get resources in. I mean, it's all of those challenges that now these schools have had to navigate. But again, I think it's the logistics there to be sure. But now imagine being that family who just had that experience, that lived experience where you felt like just in the nick of time, you got your kid out of campus. And importantly, our schools were largely safe, secure. We were able to get every single student reunited with every single family. I'm really proud of them for that. But in some cases, that perception was it was just in the nick of time. And so if that's the perception you had, how do you bring your kid back to school the next day? And our fastest school to reopened 20 days later, in terms of schools who were actually damaged from the fire. Of course, others were able to reopen sooner. There are two, though, those first days, kids and families alike, it was like kindergarten drop-off all over again, but for every grade, where kids didn't want to let go of families didn't want to let go of kids. And in part, it's they will always be informed by and contextualized by those days.
I want to talk just real quick, just because it's probably on people's mind. I want to talk a little bit about school shootings and what is that conversation like? And hopefully we've learned something from those school shootings that we can apply. So what's your conversation with school districts like related to active shooter drills and active shooting on campus?
There's a couple of layers here. I think the first is in terms of doing active shooter drills, lockdown drills, those sorts of things. The answer is yes. In general, and I generally stay away from blanket general statements like I'm making right now. I also stay away from absolutes. But I will say in this particular case, the broad majority of schools should participate in some version of a lockdown or an active shooter drill. There's some nuance there. We should be really cautious and make sure that they are trauma informed. We should make sure that they are age appropriate. We should make sure that they are announced as a drill. And of course, there's a little more to it than that. But in general, I would say, like, if you're one of those schools who's still on the fence, and I keep thinking, I've done my first lockdown drill, and then our phone rings again, and a school calls and says, hey, can you help us put together our first lockdown drill? And so clearly there are still schools out there. And so if you're on the fence, you're thinking, do I do this or not? I would say, generally speaking, yes. If you have a compelling reason, a really unique population, in many cases, that's even more of a reason to do it. Again, doesn't make it easier, but it's even more of a reason to do it if you have students who have a unique need of any sort. I won't get into the list of them today, but every one of those unique needs that you can come up with, that a school might be built around, there are responses that will support those specific students too. But then I'll also say that I am finding more and more schools that ask the question, well, how do I get ahead of this? And what's the one thing? I always get that question after a major event happens. What's the one thing I should be doing? And I always say, well, there's actually 100 things you should be doing. But if I were to try to hover around one thing, it's behavioral threat assessment. And some of our states have implemented requirements for behavioral threat assessment, some tool that says, hey, I want to check in on a student who may have either said, done, drawn, or written something that is out of the ordinary or out of character. Or I may want to do that same thing for a family member who's said, drawn, written, etc., something out of character. And I think that's the, if you were to take one thing from this conversation, I hope it's that you do a reunification drill. If you take two things, I hope it's that you implement a behavioral threat assessment team, and that you actually practice with it, and don't just go to the minimum where like the state says you have to set the meeting, and so you put it on everybody's calendar, but nobody shows up. Like I see you, I know, I've been there too.
Right.
But that you go all the way through the meeting, that you run the agenda, you build the practice, you bring it to life, and what you will find, at least what I have found across thousands of schools, is often it's not an allegation, it's not an outward threat that we will discover, although certainly you'll discover those things too, but you may find other incidents. You may find a kid who just really needs help. You may find a kid who really needs some extra support. And the team working well can catch all of those things and the really scary things we see on TV. And so why not build that mechanism? Why not build that infrastructure into our schools? Again, a whole separate podcast on exactly how to do that. There's some really good resources on our site. There's we'll drop a blog post into the show notes. But I think that's one of the big takeaways I have around active shooters and school shooter. This kind of big concern is, let's see if we can get further ahead of going into lockdown, starting the active shooter response. Let's see if we can catch that kid when they identify they need help, because it turns out they almost always do.
Yeah, and that's been part of any time it comes up in class and in courses. So I think that proactivity is helpful. But again, finding the time to do it is also significant. So, so as we wrap up here, talk to us a little bit about your book, All Clear. I see a copy behind you, and I have in my notes to talk a little bit about the rule of sevens. If you want to give us a little bit of a preview of what that looks like, and obviously, the passion for your work. Talk to us more about the passion you have for this work that you're doing in schools and the community.
I started, I was an EMS. I would respond to a 911 call, and for years I would respond and I would get to the scene, and I would see people who were standing around a person who needed help who weren't helping. And I started in Southern California, and unfortunately I started to ask people the question, well, why aren't you helping? Why didn't you help? And importantly, I asked that in a much kinder way when we were on scene and a loved one was in trouble, right? But I was trying to get to the why. I needed to understand that. And I heard generally one of three responses. I heard, number one, I didn't know what to do. Number two, I was afraid that if I did help that I would make it worse. And number three, again in Southern California, I heard, I'm afraid that if I help, I will get sued. And so I started a CPR and first aid training company with the basic idea that I was going to go out and do CPR and first aid training for as many people as I could. Important context, I was very, very young. I thought I could save the world and change the world. I still, on a good day, I wonder if maybe we're making a difference. But then I was sure it was going to happen that day. And so my belief was, my work became, I want to make sure that people have the confidence, they have the knowledge, and they understand what the legal risks and implications are for them. And I started training schools, and over the course of a few years, schools started to ask for more. They said, hey, CPR training is great, but can you help us do our fire drills? Sure. Again, Southern California, they said, can you help us do our earthquake drills? Of course. And then over the course of a few years, this organization started to build around me. I was a participant more than a leader, frankly, because schools were driving it. We started to hire people, and these team members were starting to drive folks who had been in schools, who had seen some of the challenges that had existed. I also started to talk to students and others who had been through major events, Parkland, Sandy Hook, et cetera, and really just learn from them and ask the question, how do we help schools proactively to endure situations like this in the future? And so really that organization became Joffe Emergency Services as it is today. We work with employees in 34 states. We work with over 2,000 schools. We just crossed the 100,000 threshold, so we're actually communicating with most schools in the United States, which is incredible, on our email lists and those sorts of things. But you asked about the book, and really what the book is a summary of the last almost 20 years now of our work. And it's the stories, it's the unique perspectives that we've learned from those survivors and individuals who've experienced different events. And then it breaks down what we call the rule of sevens. And for me, I'm a control freak. at my core. Like, and look, so are most principals, I think, and that not a judgment. I'm with you. But what I find is, if I can measure it, then I believe I can control it. But I believe it. And so the rule of sevens is kind of an offshoot or a framework of that belief. And the idea is that in the first 7 seconds of every emergency, there are just a few things that really need to happen. The single most important one is we need to bypass denial and accept that the emergency is happening. I wish it wasn't. I really wish it wasn't happening here. I really wish I wasn't here for it, but it is happening, and none of my wishes are going to take it away. And I often talk about the fact that denial is it's a seductively safe space, right? It's where we start divorce. It's where we start the addiction recovery process. It's where we start the beginning of any major confrontation, right? Is at some point we're going to have to break through denial, and emergencies are no different. And so that really is the fundamental need in those first 7 seconds. Well, then we go on to the first 7 minutes, and now we need to start communicating to folks, and we need to start managing the emergency. We need to do something to get ourselves back to safety. And so in that case, we activate some of those strike teams, we activate our movement restrictions if that's what's appropriate. But you can start to see there are these like really concrete expectations that need to happen in those first 7 minutes. The same is true for the first 7 hours. We need to give kids back to their families. We have to start the reunification process within 7 hours. Again, if it were 8, if it were 9, okay, fine. But in general, we want to do it fairly quickly. We want to do it certainly within the hours. We want to resume education within the days. Within about 7 days of any major event, we want to resume at least community, connection, on-campus counseling if appropriate, off-campus counseling if that's appropriate. We want to get students and adults back into some rhythm. And then again, we kind of follow that into the weeks, the months, the years later, and we allow ourselves, or really what the rule of sevens does is it codifies for us what the milestones are going to look like in the recovery process. And so I use it both proactively to say, these are the things that you need to know and understand at different phases of the emergency in order to lead. And then we also use it reactively to say, okay, by 7 months later, we need to start to think about how we're going to honor the memory because we're schools. And so every year on this date, at the beginning of every school year, on the return from winter break, we're going to see some of these things play out. And so how will we honor that? 7 years later, we need to make sure that new leaders who are welcomed into the community are actually taught about the event that occurred. Because if we lose that part of who the community is, if we don't actively teach and share and construct that story, there will still be students here, especially if we're a K-12 environment, who had an experience that the adults just don't understand. And so ultimately, that's what the rule of sevens is. It kind of summarizes almost 20 years of work into these like really concrete milestones that we want everybody to be able to perform against.
It's a lot of great information, and I really do appreciate the work that you're doing. And I have more questions, but I think I want to save it for another time. So before we go, talk to us about how we can reach out to you, how school districts can connect with you, because I'm sure that they have more questions too. So how can we do that?
Yeah, I wrote the book ultimately because I have a belief that I'm not going to be able to work with every school in the world, which is, again, an ambition, maybe inappropriate at this point, but I wished that were possible, and until it is, at least the book is a great resource. So you can pick that up. You can get to our website, joffeemergencyservices.com, and then also on all the social medias. LinkedIn is probably where I'm most active, so I'd encourage folks to get connected there. And I often will share, and this year I'm actually on a big campaign where I'm sharing this 3-year goal to the reunification exercise. I want all schools, and again, we just crossed this threshold of 100,000 schools that we're communicating with. I think some are listening. I want everybody to commit to a reunification exercise 3 years from now. And what I want is over the course of the next 3 years to kind of spoon feed you the homework assignments, the prep work, all of what needs to be true in order for you to successfully pull that off. And by the way, if you're a school that's like, wait a second, we're already doing reunification drills, first of all, congrats, and you should pat yourself on the back right now. Second of all, go with us. You can do a few in the meantime. And then we'll just watch everybody kind of make this progress together. So at the end of the day, what we do most is training for schools. And so whether that's at the district level, at the school level, often all across both, we're here to help if we can.
I think that's good stuff. Well, Chris, I appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us in the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.